The dust of the long journey clung to Ilara's worn cloak, a gritty film that mirrored the weariness settling deep in her bones. It was a tired hope, she thought, that had carried her across a continent, a hope stitched together from the neat, hopeful script of Thomas Ashton's letters. Letters that spoke of a new life, a small but sturdy house, and a land of promise beneath a wide, clear sky. Promise Creek, the place was called. The name itself had been a balm to her solitary heart, a whisper of belonging after years of quiet service in other people's homes. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, its springs groaning a final complaint, and the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of prairie winds and sun, glanced back at her, his eyes holding a strange mixture of pity and resignation. "This is it. Ashton Place is a ways out yonder. Silas here will take your trunk." He gestured with his chin towards a lanky youth who avoided her gaze. A raw wind, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain, whipped around her as she stepped down onto the parched earth. The town, if it could be called that, was a scattering of wooden buildings huddled against the vast, indifferent landscape. No welcoming committee, no sign of Thomas. A knot of unease tightened in her chest. Silas, burdened with her small trunk, pointed a hesitant finger. "Ashton Farms that way." "'Bout 2 miles," he mumbled it, then quickly retreated, leaving her standing alone as the stagecoach rumbled away, a diminishing cloud of dust its only farewell. 2 miles. She squared her shoulders, the image of Thomas's kind eyes from the small, faded photograph in her reticule giving her a sliver of courage. The letters had spoken of hardship, yes, but also of shared burdens, of building together. She was no stranger to hard work. The walk was longer than she anticipated, the sun beating down with surprising intensity for late afternoon. The landscape was stark, beautiful in its own desolate way, but offering little comfort. And then she saw it. Not the small, sturdy house of her imaginings, painted white with blue shutters as Thomas had described in a wistful postscript, but a structure that seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. Its wood was weathered to a mournful grey, a shutter hung crookedly from a single hinge, and the porch listed to one side like a ship foundering in a sea of weeds. Her steps faltered. This could not be it. Surely, there was a mistake. As she drew nearer, the silence that had pressed in on her during the walk was broken by a small, distinct sound, a child's cough, quickly stifled. Then, the door creaked open, not with a welcoming swing, but with a hesitant, furtive movement. A girl, perhaps 15 or 16, emerged. She was tall for her age, thin, with eyes that were too old for her face, filled with a weary caution. Behind her, like startled fawns, other figures appeared, smaller children, their faces smudged, their clothes patched and ill-fitting. One, a boy with a defiant stance, glared at Ilara with undisguised suspicion. There were so many. 7, she counted, her mind reeling. 7 small, silent sentinels standing before this broken house. The eldest girl, her gaze steady despite the tremor in her voice, spoke. "You'll be Miss Ilara, then?" Her voice was flat, devoid of welcome. Ilara could only nod, her throat tight. "Yes. I am Ilara Vance. I'm here for Mr. Ashton." "Thomas." A flicker of something unreadable crossed the girl's face. She gestured vaguely towards the unkempt yard. "He ain't here." "Not here." Ilara's hope, so carefully nurtured, began to fray. "Is he in town? Will he be back soon?" The girl looked down at her bare feet, scuffing the dry dirt. Behind her, a tiny girl with wide, frightened eyes peeked around her skirt. "He ain't coming back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Pa died. Near on 6 weeks ago now. Fever took him, quick." The world tilted. "Died? 6 weeks?" The letters, the promises, the photograph, all turned to ash in an instant. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. The vast prairie sky seemed to press down on her, suffocating. She reached out a hand, grasping the rickety porch railing for support. 7 pairs of eyes watched her, silent, waiting. She had journeyed to a new life, to a husband, to a home. And she had found this, a derelict farm, 7 orphan children, and a silence where a man's welcome should have been. The setting sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, casting long, somber shadows that reached towards her like grasping fingers. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, tethered to a promise that no longer existed, in a place that felt like the edge of the world. The chill of the evening air seeped into Ilara's bones, a cold that went deeper than the fading light. The eldest girl, Martha, had led her into the house, a place where shadows danced in the corners and the air was thick with the scent of dust, neglect, and unspoken sorrow. 2 rooms, a lean-to kitchen, and a cramped loft above, that was the entirety of the Ashton homestead. It was a shell, not a home. A broken hearth, empty shelves, threadbare blankets on crude pallets. The 7 children huddled together, a small, miserable flock, their eyes following Ilara's every move with a mixture of fear and a strange, unnerving watchfulness. Ilara's mind, still reeling from the shock, struggled to grasp the enormity of their situation. Her own plight was a distant hum beneath the screaming immediacy of theirs. Hunger. It was there in the hollows of their cheeks, in the 2 large eyes of the smallest ones, twins who Martha called Finn and Flora, who clung to each other like burrs. Ilara's trunk, Silas had deposited unceremoniously on the porch, contained her few belongings, some fabric, her books, and thankfully, a small store of dried biscuits and tea she'd saved from the journey. It wasn't much. "Is there anything to eat?" Ilara's voice was raspy, unfamiliar to her own ears. Martha shook her head. "Pa laid in some stores before, but they're mostly gone. We been careful." Her gaze drifted to a near-empty sack of flour in the corner. Careful. With 7 mouths to feed, careful was a cruel word. Practicality, honed by years of making do, surfaced through Ilara's shock. "The fire," she said, gesturing to the cold hearth. "We need a fire." The boy who had glared at her earlier, Samuel, about 13, scoffed. "No would cut close." "Pa always?" He trailed off, his bravado faltering. Grief, sharp and raw, flickered in his eyes before being quickly extinguished by renewed resentment. Ilara looked at Martha. "Is there an axe?" Martha nodded, pointing to a rusty tool leaning against the wall. Without a word, Ilara picked it up. It was heavy, unbalanced, but the feel of the worn wood in her hand was strangely grounding. She went outside, into the deepening twilight, and began to search for fallen branches, anything that would burn. The older children watched from the doorway, silent observers of this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere, expecting a life that had vanished before she even arrived. It took time, her hands clumsy, her muscles protesting, but eventually, she gathered enough wood to start a small, sputtering fire. The light it cast was meager, but it pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small circle of fragile warmth. She boiled water from a bucket Martha indicated came from a well out back, and made weak tea. She crumbled some of her biscuits into bowls she found, cracked and chipped, adding a little of the precious hot water to soften them. It was a pitiful meal, but as the children ate, a quiet intensity in their hunched shoulders, Ilara felt a stirring of something other than despair. A purpose, however unwelcome, however overwhelming. That night, Ilara lay on a thin pallet Martha had offered her in the main room, the children scattered around her like fallen leaves. Sleep was impossible. Her mind replayed Martha's stark words, "Pa died." The neat handwriting of Thomas's letters mocked her. Had he known he was ill when he wrote the last one, filled with such gentle anticipation of her arrival? Or had fate simply dealt its cruelest hand? And what of her? She had no money to return, no family to go back to. She was trapped, bound to these children by a promise made to a dead man. Could she leave them? The image of Finn's small, trusting hand reaching for a piece of biscuit, of Flora's solemn eyes fixed on her face, made her heart ache. Morning came with a grey, unforgiving light that revealed the full extent of the squalor. Dirt was ingrained in the floorboards, grime coated every surface, and a profound sense of hopelessness seemed to cling to the very walls. The children awoke slowly, stiffly, their faces pale. Ilara rose, her body stiff, her spirit heavier still. But as she looked at the sleeping form of Rose, a girl of about 6, her thumb tucked in her mouth, a small, determined resolve took root. She could not fix everything. She did not even know if she could fix anything. But she could clean one small part of this house. She could try to make one decent meal. She found a worn broom and began to sweep, the rhythmic motion a counterpoint to the chaos in her mind. Martha watched her for a long moment, then, without a word, picked up a rag and began to wipe down the dusty table. Samuel remained aloof, taking a piece of dry bread, a discovery from a hidden tin, and retreating outside. Lydia, a quiet girl of 10, sat sketching in the dirt with a stick, her movements precise and absorbed. Caleb, perhaps 8, eyed Elara with a mischievous glint, as if weighing her potential for disruption or amusement. Later, as Elara attempted to coax a more substantial flame from the hearth, Rose approached her hesitantly. She held out a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its paint chipped. "Pa made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She laid it gently on the mantelpiece, then looked up at Elara, her lower lip trembling. "Is Pa really in heaven with Mama?" Elara knelt, her heart clenching. She looked into Rose's innocent, questioning eyes. "Yes," she said softly, the word feeling both true and terribly inadequate. "Yes, I believe he is." Rose leaned against her for a fleeting second, a small, warm weight, before darting away. It was the briefest of connections, a tiny crack in the wall of their shared desolation, but it was something. A fragile beginning in a world that felt like an ending. The days that followed fell into a harsh, demanding rhythm. Elara, fueled by a grim determination and the dwindling supplies from her trunk, focused on the immediate, food, warmth, a semblance of cleanliness. She learned the quirks of the old stove, the way the wind whistled through the ill-fitting window frames, the particular silence of each child. Martha was her shadow, a quiet, efficient helper whose knowledge of their meager resources was invaluable. She knew which wild greens were edible, where the last potatoes were buried, how to stretch a handful of flour into a thin gruel. Samuel remained a challenge, his hostility a brittle shield. He would disappear for hours, returning with a sullen face and sometimes, unexpectedly, a snared rabbit or a few fish from the creek, which he would dump unceremoniously by the door before retreating again. His contributions were a strange mix of defiance and reluctant provision. Lydia, Elara discovered, was a ghost in the house, silent and watchful. She rarely spoke, but her eyes missed nothing. Elara often found her staring out the window, her gaze fixed on some distant point on the horizon, or meticulously arranging pebbles into intricate patterns. Caleb was a whirlwind of restless energy, prone to minor disasters, an overturned water bucket, a near miss with the precious oil lamp. He tested Elara's patience constantly, yet there was a vulnerability beneath his boisterous exterior that pricked at her conscience. Rose, after her initial overture, became Elara's little shadow, her presence a silent plea for comfort. The twins, Finn and Flora, were the purest embodiment of need. They communicated in gestures and soft murmurs, their eyes wide and often fearful, though sometimes, a shared glance with Elara would bring a fleeting, shy smile to their faces. One morning, with the flour sack perilously close to empty, Elara knew she could delay no longer. "Martha," she said, her voice more confident than she felt, "we need to go into Promise Creek." "To the general store." Martha's eyes widened slightly. "We ain't got money, Miss Elara." "I have a little," Elara said, thinking of the few coins left from her journey, coins she had hoarded for an emergency. This, surely, was an emergency. And perhaps Mr. Ashton had credit. The walk to town felt different this time, burdened by the weight of 7 young lives. Elara insisted the older children who were able accompany her, Samuel reluctantly, Lydia silently, Caleb with a restless curiosity. Rose clung to Elara's hand. Martha walked beside her, a small, anxious frown creasing her brow. As they approached the main street, Elara felt the stares. Women paused in their conversations, their eyes lingering on her, then on the children. Whispers followed them like unseen insects, prickling her skin. "That's them, the Ashton orphans, and her?" "Who's she?" "Mail order, I heard. Came for a husband, found that the judgment was a palpable force, pressing in on her." Ilara kept her chin high, her gaze fixed ahead, though her cheeks burned. The general store, run by a Mr. Henderson, was a dim, cluttered space smelling of coffee, leather, and dust. Henderson was a man with a face like weathered timber, his eyes shrewd beneath bushy brows. He looked from Ilara to the children and back again, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Henderson," Ilara began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am Ilara Vance. I've come to care for the Ashton children." Henderson grunted, polishing a countertop with a stained rag. "Heard Thomas passed." "Bad business." He didn't offer condolences, just stated a fact. "Yes. We are in need of supplies, Mr. Henderson. Flour, salt, perhaps some beans. Did Mr. Ashton, did he have an account here?" Henderson paused his polishing. "Thomas Ashton paid cash when he had it. Owed me a bit here and there, but mostly settled up before." He let the sentence hang. "Credit's a tricky thing. Especially now." Ilara's heart sank. "I have a little money," she said, placing her few coins on the counter. They looked pitifully small. "But it won't be enough for long." Henderson eyed the coins, then Ilara's earnest, worried face. He looked at Martha, standing straight and proud despite her patched dress, at Samuel, whose defiance couldn't quite mask his hunger. He let out a slow breath. "All right, Miss Vance. I'll let you have some flour, beans, a bit of lard. On account. But you'll need to find a way to settle it. Promise Creek ain't a charity, much as some might wish it." His tone was gruff, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding perhaps, that gave Ilara a sliver of hope. As they gathered their meager purchases, a shadow fell across the doorway. A woman, tall and imposing, dressed in severe black, entered the store. Her gaze swept over Ilara and the children, sharp and appraising. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable air of authority. "I see the Ashton brood is out and about. And who, pray tell, is this?" Her eyes, cold as river stones, fixed on Ilara. Mr. Henderson merely grunted. "This is Miss Vance, Mrs. Gable. Says she's here to look after Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into a disapproving line. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This woman, she sensed, would be a formidable obstacle. Back at the farm, the small sack of flour felt like treasure. That evening, after a supper of bean stew and freshly baked, if slightly flat, bread, Ilara found a quiet moment. She rummaged through her trunk and pulled out a small, leather-bound book of Thomas's she'd found tucked under his pillow, not letters, but a sort of journal, filled with notes about the farm, sketches of fences he planned to build, and surprisingly, a few pressed wildflowers. Tucked inside was a half-finished letter addressed to her, dated only days before his death. It spoke of his eagerness for her arrival, his hopes for their future, a poignant description of a sunset he wished they could watch together. Tears pricked Ilara's eyes. This man, this stranger she had come to marry, had been real, his dreams as vivid as her own. It didn't lessen her burden, but it subtly shifted its weight, imbuing it with a more personal sorrow, a more profound sense of a future stolen from them all. That night, as Finn slept beside her, his small hand unconsciously seeking hers, Ilara knew she couldn't abandon them. Whatever came, she would face it here. The respite offered by Mr. Henderson's grudging credit was short-lived. A few days later, as Ilara was attempting to mend a tear in Samuel's oversized shirt, a smart buggy pulled up before the dilapidated farmhouse. Mrs. Gable descended, her black dress a stark silhouette against the dusty yard. She carried an air of grim purpose, like a vulture circling. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She set aside her sewing, smoothed her apron, and met the woman on the porch. The children, sensing the tension, gathered behind her, a silent, wary phalanx. "Miss Vance," Mrs. Gable began without preamble, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "I am here on behalf of the town council and the Ladies' Benevolent Society. We have, of course, been aware of the unfortunate situation regarding the Ashton children since Thomas's passing." Her gaze flicked dismissively over the patched clothes and smudged faces. "It is our considered opinion that these children require proper care. An orphanage in Springwells has agreed to take them. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. An orphanage? The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. Springwells was miles away, a place none of them knew. The children would be separated, their fragile world shattered completely. No, Ilara said, her voice surprisingly firm. They will not go to an orphanage. Mrs. Gable raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. And who are you, Miss Vance, to make such a declaration? You are a stranger here. You arrived expecting to marry a man who is now deceased. You have no claim, no resources. These children need stability, proper supervision, things you clearly cannot provide. Her eye swept critically over the house, the untended yard. A fire ignited within Ilara, a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. I may be a stranger to you, Mrs. Gable, she said, her voice low but steady, but I am not a stranger to hard work. I made a promise, albeit to a man who is no longer here, but these children, they are here. They are his legacy. They deserve to stay together, in their home. Their home? Mrs. Gable scoffed. This hovel? It is unsuitable. They are running wild, underfed, uneducated. They are grieving, Ilara countered, her gaze unwavering. And they are surviving. We are surviving. Give us a chance. I will make this a home. I will care for them. Suddenly, a small voice piped up from behind Ilara. We want to stay with Miss Ilara. It was Martha, her face pale but her chin held high. She's good to us. Samuel, standing beside his sister, didn't speak, but he crossed his arms, his stance defiant, his glare fixed on Mrs. Gable. Even little Rose peeked out, clutching Ilara's skirt. Mrs. Gable looked momentarily taken aback by Martha's quiet intervention, but her resolve quickly hardened. Sentiment is admirable, child, but impractical. Miss Vance, the council has empowered me to make arrangements. I will return in 1 month. If, by then, I do not see significant improvement, and frankly, I doubt I will have no choice but to proceed with placing the children in Springwells. For their own good, of course. She gave a curt nod, turned, and climbed back into her buggy, leaving a cloud of dust and a chilling ultimatum in her wake. 1 month. The words echoed in Ilara's mind. 30 short days to transform a broken-down farm and 7 weary hearts into something resembling a stable home, all under the threat of Mrs. Gable's disapproval. The task felt monumental, impossible. As the buggy disappeared down the track, Ilara sank onto the porch step, her knees weak. The children gathered around her, their earlier fear replaced by a new, anxious dependence. Martha sat beside her. She can't really take us, can she, Miss Ilara? Ilara looked at their faces, Martha's quiet strength, Samuel's reluctant fear, Lydia's wide, observing eyes, Caleb's sudden stillness, Rose's tear-filled gaze, and the twins, Finn and Flora, who seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their usual small chatter silenced. Her own initial despair, the temptation to flee this overwhelming responsibility, vanished. These children were looking to her. She was their only shield against a cold, indifferent world. No, Ilara said, her voice regaining its strength, a new resolve hardening within her. No, she will not take you. We will not let her. She stood up, pulling Martha with her. We have 1 month. We have work to do. The confrontation, terrifying as it was, had an unexpected effect. It was a crucible, forging a new dynamic. Ilara was no longer just the strange woman who had appeared in their lives, she was their defender. And they, in turn, were no longer just Thomas Ashton's orphans, they were her charge, her responsibility, and perhaps, something more. The fight for their future had begun. The weight of Mrs. Gable's ultimatum pressed down on Ilara, a constant, unwelcome presence. 1 month. It was a ridiculously short span of time to mend a life, let alone 7, and a dilapidated farm besides. Yet, the threat acted as a peculiar kind of fuel, igniting a desperate energy within her. She surveyed the neglected land surrounding the farmhouse, acres of dusty, weed-choked soil that Thomas, in his letters, had dreamt of turning into productive fields. His journal contained rough sketches of crop rotations, notes on well digging, plans for a chicken coop. These faded inkings were now Ilara's only map. "Martha," Ilara said the morning after Mrs. Gable's visit, "your father, did he plant anything this year before?" Martha shook her head. "He was getting the seed. Said he'd start after you came." The words hung in the air, a reminder of another broken plan. "There's a patch yonder he always did potatoes in. And some tools in the shed, I think." The shed was a ramshackle affair, but inside, amongst cobwebs and rust, they found a few usable implements: a spade with a cracked handle, a hoe, a sturdy rake. Samuel, who had overheard them, appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Ground's hard," he muttered, kicking at a loose clod of earth. "Pa always said this soil needs a lot of work." "Then we'll work it," Ilara said, meeting his gaze. "All of us. If we want to stay here, if we want to show Mrs. Gable we can manage, this farm has to give us something." To her surprise, Samuel didn't argue. He picked up the spade. "Show me where." And so began their unlikely partnership. Ilara, with no farming experience beyond a small kitchen garden in her previous life, relied on Martha's childhood memories of her father's methods and Samuel's surprising strength. They tackled the potato patch first, clearing weeds, turning over the stubborn soil. It was back-breaking labor. Ilara's hands, accustomed to needlework and domestic chores, were soon raw and blistered. Her muscles ached with a profound weariness each night. But with every patch of cleared earth, every row they managed to till, a small sense of accomplishment bloomed. Lydia, quiet as ever, began to help in her own way. She took charge of collecting kindling, her small hand surprisingly adept at snapping dry twigs. She also proved to have a gentle touch with the few scrawny chickens that had survived, ensuring they had fresh water. Caleb, whose energy had previously been a source of minor chaos, was tasked with carrying water from the well, a job he performed with a newfound, if sometimes grumbling, seriousness. Rose, too young for heavy labor, was put in charge of a tiny patch near the kitchen door where Ilara hoped to plant some herbs, should she ever acquire any seeds. She watered it diligently with a rusty can, chattering to the unresponsive earth. The twins, Finn and Flora, often sat nearby, watching the flurry of activity, their presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. One afternoon, as Ilara and Samuel struggled to repair a section of broken fence meant to keep out stray animals, Mr. Henderson from the general store rode by on his wagon. He paused, watching them for a moment, his expression typically gruff. Ilara expected a reminder about her outstanding account. Instead, he called out, using the wrong kind of nail for that post, "Miss Vance. Needs to be longer, or it won't hold in a strong wind." He rummaged in his wagon and produced a handful of sturdy nails. "Here. And that wire you're using is too thin. Got some stronger gauge back at the store, if you need it. Can put it on your account." Ilara was taken aback by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. That's very good of you." He just grunted. No sense doing a job halfway. Waste of time. But as he drove off, Ilara thought she saw the ghost of a smile on his lips. There were failures, of course. An attempt to plant some old beans they found resulted in nothing but withered shoots. A sudden downpour turned their newly tilled patch into a muddy quagmire, undoing a day's work. But with each setback, Ilara felt her resolve solidify. She would learn. She would adapt. They would endure. Evenings became a cherished, if exhausted, ritual. After a simple meal, usually a thin stew or porridge, Ilara would light the single oil lamp. Its warm glow cast flickering shadows on their faces as she read aloud. Her only book suitable for children was an old, battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress, its allegorical journey strangely resonant with their own struggles. The children would listen, captivated. Even Samuel, who initially feigned indifference, would inch closer to the circle of light, his earlier hostility slowly eroding in the face of shared labor and the magic of a story told. Sometimes, after the reading, if the air wasn't too cold, they would sit on the porch, and Ilara would point out the constellations, naming them softly, tales her own father had told her long ago. In those quiet moments, under the vast, star-dusted sky, the ramshackle farmhouse almost felt like a home. And the sounds of their shared breathing, the occasional sleepy sigh from one of the little ones, was a sweeter music than Ilara had ever known. They were building something, not just on the land, but between themselves, brick by weary brick, word by hopeful word. The relentless labor on the farm began to chip away at the children's defenses, revealing the vulnerable individuals beneath. Samuel, in particular, remained an enigma to Ilara. His sullenness was a heavy cloak, rarely lifted. He worked hard, often pushing himself to exhaustion, as if trying to outrun a shadow only he could see. One sweltering afternoon, while they were clearing stones from a new patch of ground intended for corn, Caleb, in a fit of boyish exuberance, accidentally knocked over a carefully piled cairn of rock Samuel had just finished. Samuel's temper, always simmering close to the surface, exploded. He lunged at Caleb, his face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. Ilara intervened quickly, stepping between them, her voice firm but calm. "Samuel! That's enough." Samuel, breathing heavily, glared at her, then at a frightened Caleb. "He's always messing things up. He doesn't care." "It was an accident, Samuel," Ilara said gently, her hand on his trembling arm. Caleb didn't mean it. She looked at Caleb, whose eyes were wide with fear and remorse. "Apologize to your brother, Caleb." Caleb mumbled a hasty apology, then scurried away, close to tears. Samuel stood rigid, his fists clenched. Ilara didn't scold him further. Instead, she said quietly, "Let's rebuild it together." He resisted for a moment, then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he bent down and picked up a stone. They worked in silence for a while. Then, hesitantly, Samuel spoke, his voice low. Pa was going to teach me to build a proper stone wall this summer." For the pasture, his voice cracked on the last word. He didn't look at Ilara, just kept his gaze fixed on the stones in his hands. "He always said I was strong enough. Strong like him." Ilara listened, her heart aching for the boy whose grief was so tightly bound with anger. "He must have been very proud of you, Samuel," she said softly. "You are strong. And you work hard, just like he would have wanted." Samuel didn't reply, but some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a tiny fissure in the armor he wore so fiercely. Lydia, too, began to emerge from her shell, though in a much quieter way. Ilara had noticed her constant sketching, in the dirt, on scraps of wood, with bits of charcoal found in the hearth. One evening, Ilara found a small, smooth piece of planking and an almost full pencil stub she'd kept from her journey. She offered them to Lydia. "I thought you might like these." Lydia's eyes, usually so guarded, widened with a mixture of surprise and delight. She took them tentatively, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. Later that week, Ilara found Lydia sitting under the lone tree in the yard, absorbed in her drawing. She was sketching the dilapidated farmhouse, but in her drawing, the roof was straight, flowers bloomed in the weed-choked yard, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. It was a picture of hope, rendered with a surprising skill. "That's beautiful, Lydia," Ilara said gently, careful not to startle her. Lydia blushed, but a small smile touched her lips. "It's how I wish it was," she whispered. Mama liked flowers." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother. Ilara encouraged her, praising her talent, finding her more scraps of paper whenever Mr. Henderson had some wrapping to discard. Lydia's drawings became a quiet chronicle of their lives, capturing small moments, Rose chasing a butterfly, Finn and Flora asleep with their arms around each other, Samuel staring thoughtfully at the horizon. The twins, Finn and Flora, were becoming more verbal, their chatter a constant, cheerful babble around the farm. They had taken to calling Ilara Della, a soft, sweet sound that never failed to warm her heart. They followed her everywhere, their small hands often seeking hers for reassurance. They were a constant reminder of the innocent lives entrusted to her care. The farm, under their collective effort, was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to show signs of life. The potato patch was greening, and the small patch of corn they'd planted with seed grudgingly supplied by Mr. Henderson, on further credit, with a lecture about responsible farming, was showing tentative shoots. The house, too, felt different. It was cleaner, more organized. Elara had used some of her fabric to make new curtains for the windows, and Lydia had decorated a corner with her drawings. It was still a poor, struggling place, but it was their place. The threat of Mrs. Gable and the orphanage still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but within the fragile walls of the Ashton farm, something new and precious was taking root, a family, forged not by blood, but by shared hardship and a growing, unspoken affection. Just as a fragile sense of stability began to settle over the Ashton household, crisis struck, swift and terrifying. It began with Flora, the smaller of the twins. One morning, she awoke listless, her small face flushed with fever. By midday, she was burning hot, her breathing shallow and rapid. Elara's heart plunged into an icy fear. Illness on the prairie was a dreaded foe, swift and often deadly, especially for the young. There was no doctor in Promise Creek, the nearest was a day's ride away in Springwells, an impossible journey. Elara drew on every scrap of knowledge she possessed about nursing the sick. She bathed Flora's forehead with cool water, tried to coax sips of weak willow bark tea, a remedy Martha remembered her mother using, between her parched lips. The small cabin felt suddenly suffocating, the silence broken only by Flora's labored breaths and Finn's anxious whimpers. Finn refused to leave his sister's side, his small hand clutching hers. Martha was a rock, her young face etched with worry but her hand steady as she helped Elara. She kept the fire low, fetched fresh water, and spoke in soothing tones to her little sister. Samuel, for the first time, seemed stripped of all his bravado. He hovered helplessly in the doorway, his face pale, his usual scowl replaced by a look of raw fear. He repeatedly asked if there was anything he could do, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Elara sent him to chop extra wood, to check the water barrels, anything to channel his anxious energy. Lydia sat quietly in a corner, her sketchbook lying forgotten, her eyes wide and fixed on Flora. Rose, bless her innocent heart, tried to offer Flora her precious wooden bird, her face crumpled with concern. The fever raged through the night. Elara did not sleep, keeping vigil by Flora's small pallet, changing cool cloths, whispering words of comfort she wasn't sure the child could hear. The little body felt so fragile, so terribly vulnerable. Desperation gnawed at Elara. What if her efforts weren't enough? The thought of losing one of them, after all they had endured, was unbearable. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in her mind, "Things you clearly cannot provide." Was this proof? Was she failing them? By the second day, Flora was weaker, her breaths fainter. Elara knew she needed more than home remedies. She remembered a family, the Grubbers, who lived on a farm a few miles distant. They were German immigrants, known for keeping to themselves and for Mrs. Grubber's knowledge of herbs. They were also known for their stern, unwelcoming demeanor. Elara had only seen them from a distance in town, never spoken to them. But desperation made her bold. "Samuel," she said, her voice strained, "I need you to stay here with Martha. Watch Flora. I'm going to the Grubber farm. To see if Mrs. Grubber can help." Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with a new, sober responsibility. "Be careful, Miss Elara." The walk to the Grubber farm was a blur of anxiety. When she arrived, Mr. Grubber, a taciturn man with hands like gnarled roots, met her at the door, his expression suspicious. Elara, her words tumbling out, explained Flora's plight. He listened without interruption, then simply said, "Wait," and disappeared inside. Elara waited on the porch, her heart pounding, half expecting to be sent away. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Grubber appeared. She was a stout woman with kind eyes that belied her husband's sternness. She listened again as Elara described Flora's symptoms. Then, without a word, she went back inside and returned with a small bundle of dried herbs and a jar of dark syrup. "Feverfew and boneset for tea," she said, her English accented but clear. "This syrup for the cough. Small sips. Keep her warm, but not too warm." Pray, she pressed the remedies into Elara's hands. How can I repay you?" Ilara stammered, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. Mrs. Grubber simply shook her head. "Children are a blessing." Sometimes a worry, a rare smile touched her lips. "You are the new woman at the Ashton place? The one with all the little ones?" Ilara nodded. "Is hard work, J.A.? But good work." Ilara hurried back, her hope rekindled. She administered the remedies as Mrs. Grubber had instructed. For another day and night, the outcome hung in the balance. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. Flora's fever started to recede. Her breathing eased. By the third morning, she opened her eyes, and though weak, she managed a faint smile when she saw Finn's anxious face beside her. The relief that washed over the small cabin was immense, a palpable wave that left them all weak but profoundly grateful. Samuel actually let out a whoop of joy before quickly stifling it, a flush rising on his cheeks. Martha wept silently into her apron. Ilara sank onto a stool, her body trembling with exhaustion and release. They had faced a terrible foe and, together, with the unexpected help of a reserved neighbor, they had won. Flora would live. The illness, and Flora's recovery, marked another turning point. The townsfolk, who had heard whispers of the child's grave condition, saw Ilara's tireless devotion. Mr. Henderson, when Ilara next went to the store, pressed a small bag of barley into her hand. "Good for broth," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "Helps build strength." Even Mrs. Gable, whom Ilara glimpsed watching from a distance as she aired out bedding, seemed to regard her with a slightly less severe expression, though she offered no words. Ilara knew her love for these children was no longer a matter of duty or resolve, it was a deep, fierce, and irrevocable part of her. They were hers, in a way she could never have anticipated, bound by shared fear, shared hope, and now, a shared victory over the shadow of death. Flora's recovery, slow but steady, cast a gentle light over the Ashton farm. The shared ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of mistrust among the children and had solidified Ilara's place as the unwavering center of their world. News of her steadfast nursing, coupled with Mrs. Grubber's quiet endorsement, began to subtly shift perceptions in Promise Creek. The whispers didn't entirely cease, but their tone changed from outright condemnation to a grudging curiosity, even a reluctant admiration. One Sunday, Ilara, after much internal debate, decided they should attend the small church service in town. She wanted the children to feel a part of the community, not isolated outcasts. She also felt a deep need to offer quiet thanks for Flora's return to health. She spent Saturday evening mending their best, albeit still patched, clothes. Lydia helped her press them with a heavy flat iron heated on the stove. There was an air of nervous anticipation as they set out, Ilara walking with Martha and Lydia, while Samuel, looking uncharacteristically scrubbed and solemn, kept a watchful eye on Caleb, Rose, and the twins, who clutched each other's hands. Their entrance into the small, crowded church caused a hush. All eyes turned towards them. Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck but kept her gaze steady, her expression calm. She led the children to an empty pew near the back. During the service, she was acutely aware of the sideways glances, the muted murmurs. But there were also a few hesitant smiles, a nod from Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife. After the sermon, as people milled outside, a few women approached her. One, a kindly-faced woman named Sarah Miller, whose farm bordered the old Ashton property to the east, offered Ilara a small jar of apple butter. For the children, she said with a warm smile, "My Ben says you're working that land like a Trojan, Miss Vance. It's good to see." Another woman, whose name Ilara didn't catch, pressed a bundle of outgrown children's clothing into her arms. "They're not much, but perhaps you can make use of them." These small gestures of kindness were like balm to Ilara's spirit. Even Mr. Henderson seemed to thaw further. The next time Ilara was in his store, he cleared his throat and said, "Heard you might be looking for a bit of cash work, Miss Vance. My wife needs some mending done, more than she can handle with her rheumatism acting up. And folks always appreciate good baked bread if you've a mind to sell a few loaves." Ilara's heart leaped. "Oh, Mr. Henderson, yes. I would be very grateful for the opportunity." So, Ilara began to take in mending, her nimble fingers flying by lamplight after the children were asleep. She also started baking extra loaves of bread, using the skills she'd honed over years of domestic service. Samuel would take them into town to sell, returning with a few precious coins that went towards their account at the store or for much-needed supplies. Lydia's drawings, too, began to attract notice. During one of their trips to town, she had shyly shown Mr. Henderson a sketch she'd made of his storefront. The storekeeper, visibly impressed, had tacked it up near the counter. Now, people sometimes asked Lydia to draw their horses, their dogs, even their children, offering a penny or two for her efforts. Her quiet talent was becoming a small source of pride and income for the family. The farm itself was responding to their relentless efforts. The potato plants were thriving, and the corn stood surprisingly tall. They had even managed to acquire a few more chickens, thanks to a barter arranged by Mr. Grubber, Ilara's mending skills in exchange for pullets. The house, though still humble, felt more like a home each day. Fresh wildflowers, gathered by rows, often graced the table. The sound of Caleb's laughter, less wild now, more joyful, mingled with the twins' cheerful chatter. Mrs. Gable was still a presence, her buggy occasionally seen passing by the farm, her gaze as assessing as ever. But Ilara no longer felt the same sharp fear. They were building something tangible here, a life, a family, a place of belonging. The seeds of hope, planted in desperate soil, were beginning to sprout, nurtured by hard work, resilience, and the quiet, steady growth of love. The month she had been given was drawing to a close, but Ilara faced the impending deadline not with dread, but with a quiet confidence in what they had achieved. The relative peace was shattered by the arrival of an official-looking envelope, delivered by the stagecoach driver with a solemnity that immediately set Ilara on edge. It was addressed to the occupants of the Ashton farm. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, a crisply typed letter informed her that, due to outstanding debts accrued by the late Thomas Ashton against the property and the unresolved matter of the children's guardianship, a formal hearing had been scheduled before the town council and a circuit magistrate in 1 week's time. The purpose, to determine the final disposition of the Ashton children and the farm itself. Mrs. Gable's name was mentioned as the primary petitioner for the children's removal. The letter felt like a death knell to all their hard-won progress. 1 week. Just as they were beginning to breathe, to hope, the axe was poised to fall. Ilara read it again, the legalistic phrases blurring before her eyes. Outstanding debts, unresolved guardianship, final disposition. It sounded so cold, so clinical, for something that would tear their fragile family apart. She gathered the older children, Martha and Samuel, and explained the letter's contents, her voice heavy. Martha's face went pale. Samuel clenched his fists, his earlier defiance resurfacing, but this time it was mingled with a desperate fear. "They can't do that, can they?" he demanded. "After everything? This is our home." "We'll fight it, Samuel," Ilara said, though her own heart was filled with a chilling dread. "We have to." The next few days were a blur of anxious preparation. Ilara meticulously cleaned the house, mended clothes until her fingers ached, and coached the children on how to behave. She tried to understand the nature of Thomas's debts, poring over his old account books, but the figures were confusing, incomplete. She felt woefully inadequate, a lone woman with no legal knowledge, armed only with her fierce love for these children, about to face a council of men who likely saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient complication. The day of the hearing dawned grey and overcast, mirroring Ilara's mood. She dressed herself and the children in their neatest, if still patched, clothes. Lydia had drawn a picture of their family, all 7 children and Ilara, standing before their little farmhouse, the sun shining brightly above them. She pressed it into Ilara's hand. "For good luck," she whispered. They walked to the town hall, a small, somber procession. Ilara's stomach churned with nerves. The council chamber was packed. Most of the town seemed to be there, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and judgment. Mrs. Gable sat at the front, her expression severe and confident, a sheaf of papers before her. The circuit magistrate, Judge Miller, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes, presided. The hearing began. Mrs. Gable presented her case first, her voice clear and articulate. She spoke of Thomas Ashton's financial instability, the dilapidated state of the farm upon Ilara's arrival, and her concerns for the children's welfare under the care of an unrelated, inexperienced woman. She painted a picture of Ilara as an interloper, well-meaning perhaps, but ultimately incapable. Then it was Ilara's turn. Her knees felt like water as she stood. She had no legal arguments, no carefully prepared speech. She could only speak from the heart. "Your Honor, members of the council," she began, her voice trembling slightly at first, then gaining strength. "It is true that when I arrived, this farm was neglected, and these children were adrift. Their father was gone, their world turned upside down. I, too, felt adrift. I came expecting a different life." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But what I found here, what we have built together in these past months, is not what Mrs. Gable describes." She spoke of their hard work, of the crops they had planted, the repairs they had made. She spoke of Flora's illness and how they had nursed her back to health. She spoke of Lydia's talent, Samuel's strength, Martha's quiet wisdom, the joy the younger ones brought. "These children are not a burden," she said, a gaze sweeping over the councilman, then settling on Judge Miller. "They are a family. This farm is their home. And I am their mother now, in every way that matters." As she spoke, she saw Mr. Henderson nod slowly. Mrs. Grubber, sitting near the back, gave her an encouraging smile. Then, to Ilara's astonishment, Martha rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "Miss Ilara speaks the truth. Before she came, we were lost. She brought us back. She taught us to work, to hope. We ain't ever been cared for better. Please, don't send us away. Don't take her from us." Samuel, his face set with determination, stood beside his sister, his hand protectively on her arm. He didn't speak, but his loyal presence spoke volumes. Then Mr. Henderson stood. "Judge," he said, his voice gruff. "I've known the Ashtons a long time. Thomas, he had his struggles, no doubt. But these children, they're good children. And this Miss Vance, she's worked harder than any 10 men I know to make a go of it. She pays her debts, or works them off. That farm is coming back to life because of her and those young uns. They belong together, on that land." Even Sarah Miller, the farmer's wife, spoke up, praising Ilara's resilience and the visible improvement in the children's well-being. Judge Miller listened to it all, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Gable looked increasingly discomforted by the unexpected outpouring of support. When everyone had spoken, a long silence filled the room. Ilara held her breath, her hand clutching Lydia's drawing so tightly her knuckles were white. Finally, Judge Miller cleared his throat. He looked at Mrs. Gable, then at Ilara and the children. "Mrs. Gable," he said, "your concerns were not without merit initially. However, it appears Miss Vance, with the help of these children and, it seems, a good portion of this community, has achieved something remarkable." He paused. "Regarding the debts on the property, arrangements can be made for a stay, provided the farm continues to show productivity. As for guardianship..." He looked directly at Ilara. "Miss Vance, the testimony we have heard today speaks powerfully to your character and your commitment. It is the decision of this council, and this court, that the Ashton children shall remain in your care, on the Ashton farm, under your provisional guardianship, to be reviewed in 1 year." A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over Ilara. Tears welled in her eyes. Beside her, Martha let out a sob of joy, and Samuel actually grinned. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, mostly of approval. Mrs. Gable sat stiffly, her face a mask of disapproval, but she said nothing more. The fight was over. They had won. Their future, so precarious just moments before, was now, blessedly, their own to shape. Life on the Ashton farm settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the steady pulse of a family working together. The shadow of the hearing, and Mrs. Gable's threat, receded, replaced by the golden light of an earned security. The farm, under their diligent hands, began to yield its bounty. The potato harvest was plentiful, the corn surprisingly good. They stored potatoes and cabbages in a root cellar Samuel and Ilara dug, ensuring food for the coming winter. Ilara's mending and baking, along with Lydia's charming sketches, continued to bring in a small but steady income, enough to keep their account at Mr. Henderson's store in good standing and even purchase a few much-needed comforts, warmer blankets, sturdy shoes for the children. The house, once a symbol of neglect and sorrow, was now filled with the sounds of life. Laughter echoed in the small rooms, often instigated by Caleb's playful antics or the twins' developing sense of humor. Lydia's drawings adorned the walls, vibrant depictions of their daily lives, Samuel proudly leading a newly acquired goat, a payment for a large mending job, Martha kneading bread with flour-dusted hands, Rose carefully tending her small herb garden, which now boasted fragrant mint and thyme. Ilara had even managed to whitewash the exterior walls, using lime purchased with her earnings, and Samuel had repaired the crooked shutter. It wasn't the grand house Thomas had once described in his letters, but it was sturdy, warm, and undeniably theirs. Ilara often found herself pausing in her work, looking at the children, a profound sense of wonder and gratitude filling her. These 7 young souls, once wary strangers, were now inextricably woven into the fabric of her being. Martha, no longer a girl but a capable young woman, was Ilara's right hand, her calm competence a steadying influence. Samuel, his anger largely vanquished, had grown into a responsible young man, his protective instincts now channeled into caring for the farm and his younger siblings. He still had moments of quiet reflection, but the bitterness was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. Lydia, her artistic talents blossoming, filled their home with beauty and her gentle spirit. Caleb's boundless energy was now directed into helpful chores, though his mischievous spark remained. Rose was a sunbeam, her affection open and freely given. And the twins, Finn and Flora, chattered and played, their earlier anxieties forgotten, secure in the unwavering love that surrounded them. One crisp autumn evening, as the scent of wood smoke and baking apples filled the air, they gathered around the hearth. The firelight danced on their faces, illuminating expressions of contentment. Ilara was reading aloud, not from Pilgrim's Progress this time, but from a new book of stories Mr. Henderson had given her, a collection of folk tales and legends. The children listened, rapt, their heads leaning against each other. Later, after the younger ones were asleep, Ilara sat on the porch with Martha and Samuel, watching the harvest moon rise over the fields. "Do you ever think about him, Miss Ilara?" Martha asked softly, her gaze on the silvery landscape. "Our Pa." Ilara looked out at the land Thomas Ashton had loved, the land he had hoped to share with her. "Yes, Martha, I do," she replied gently. "I think he would be proud of what you've all become. Of what we've built here." Samuel, who rarely spoke of his father, nodded slowly. He wanted this place to be good. For as he looked at Ilara, a rare, open gratitude in his eyes. "You made it good, Miss Ilara." Tears pricked Ilara's eyes. The journey had been so different from what she had envisioned when she first read Thomas Ashton's hopeful letters. The husband she had traveled so far to meet was a memory, a ghost in the stories the children sometimes told. But in his place, she had found something far more profound, far more demanding, and ultimately, far more rewarding. She had found a purpose that resonated in the deepest part of her soul. She had found a family, forged in hardship, bound by love. Promise Creek. The name no longer felt ironic. It held a new meaning now. It wasn't the promise of an easy life or a life with a husband. It was the promise of what could be created with courage, perseverance, and an open heart. It was the promise she saw reflected in the eyes of the 7 children who called her Nella, who called her mother. She had arrived a mail-order bride with a tired hope, seeking a new beginning. She had found it, not in the arms of a man, but in the embrace of a family she had chosen, and who had, in turn, chosen her. As the moon climbed higher, casting its serene glow over their small, peaceful farm, Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was home.